All right. Thank you very much. Nice to meet you, everyone. My name is Mike Schaekermann. I'm from the University of Waterloo, where I'm currently a master's student in the Technical School of Computer Science. My supervisors are Edith Law, who is also here, and Leonard Nacke. And today I would like to talk a little bit about my research with Edith Law at the intersection of crowdsourcing and machine learning. And in particular, I'd like to address quite a fundamental topic in the realm of machine learning, which is ambiguity in ground truth. This is something that we've come across when we try to use crowdsourcing for, in order to establish ground truth in certain application domains. In certain application domains, which I will come to talk about. And in particular, I will address different types of ambiguity, which we call either resolvable or irresolvable. And we'll roughly sketch out a new hybrid framework, which we have been thinking about for a while and are going to implement in the future, which we devised in order to be able to deal with uncertainty in ground truth in a more nuanced fashion than it is normally being done in many research papers. And by we, I mean the authors of the position paper for this workshop, which are Edith Law, myself, Alex Williams, and William Callaghan. Alex and William are also being supervised by Edith Law in the Waterloo HCI lab of the School of Computer Science at Waterloo. So maybe let me just jump into the problem statement, which I will be talking about here. So there is this assumption in supervised machine learning, especially I will be alleging examples from classification, that in ground truth data you normally have exactly one correct label per training example. And the procedure, how people go about getting these correct labels, is they have a data set of unlabeled training examples normally, and they go to an expert and ask this expert to give them the correct labels for all these unlabeled training examples. Which is, so far so good. The problem arises really when you realize that there is not always one correct answer for all training examples in the real world. And in particular, what happens when you give the same training example to multiple experts or even non-experts, you might get different answers. And the reasons why you get these different answers can be manifold. There might be divergent understandings in the problem definitions, or different experts might have different training backgrounds, might have been educated at different institutions, where they might have gotten maybe different interpretations, slightly different interpretations of how to deal with certain instances of ground truth, or with certain instances of just objects of whatever kind. And then there's also this thing, different people might have different access to contextual information, which might help them to come to a certain conclusion about a training example. So there are various factors that can actually affect what the correct label our experts will give us will be. So, and as I said, if you give the same training example to multiple experts, you might get multiple different answers, which is a common problem, and I think everyone has heard about that. And the normal strategies how people tackle this in the machine learning research that we've read about is you either completely ignore that there may be ambiguity in the ground truth and basically just discard whatever ambiguous training examples you have. This is kind of the most radical approach. Then there are other approaches which kind of forcefully merge different divergent opinions into one consensus opinion, mostly by taking a majority vote. For example, if two experts say the correct label would be A, and one expert says the correct label would be B, then they basically just assume that the really correct label is A. However, both of these approaches kind of disregard the fact that there might actually be inherent ambiguity in the ground truth. And what I mean by inherent is no matter how much context you provide to all the experts that you have, they might still disagree on what it is. And I would like to talk a little bit about examples that we've come across in our research that really show that this kind of ambiguity is actually existent. And just giving you some examples of different types of ambiguity that we've come across, some of which are resolvable in our minds and some of which might actually not be resolvable. I'll give examples from 3 different application domains. The first one is the annotation of medical time series data, and in particular, one of the projects that we are currently working on, which is called Crowd EEG, really presents multi-channel time series data, which is, for example, from electroencephalographic recordings at the top here, or maybe even heartbeat recordings at the bottom, and presents that to clinical experts, at least in this view. We also do this with non-experts, but that's a slightly different story. And what we ask these experts to do is go through the signals, and whatever low-level features they detect in the signal, we ask them to annotate by just drawing these little colorful colored boxes, and every color is for a different type of feature. So in this case, okay, so far so good, they do that, and if we give the same signal to different experts, there are different nuances of disagreement that might arise. So perfect agreement would mean that 2 experts basically look at the signal and they see a feature at some point and they have perfect alignment of how they annotate the feature. Then there might be a very radical form of disagreement. For example, expert 1 says, okay, I actually see a sleep spindle, which is like a low-level feature indicative of a certain sleep stage. I see a sleep spindle here, and expert 2 says, actually, no, I don't see any sleep spindle there. I see something else, maybe something called alpha activity, or whatever. So there's like a sort of a gap between one expert actually seeing a feature being present, while the other expert doesn't really think that there is a feature at all. And then there are more let's say, more nuanced forms of disagreement, where maybe both experts think that there is a feature in a certain region, but the beginning and the end time where they annotated might only partially overlap. And this is an example of where we think, okay, we actually, if we give them some kind of form of interaction or more context, they might eventually agree on a consensus opinion, whereas the former example is an example of, well, probably they still will disagree because they already have a good reason why they have such divergent opinions. So this example would be one where the likelihood that the disagreement is irresolvable is fairly high. But let me just quickly jump to the next example, which I cannot go too deeply into because I'm not an expert in it, but this is one of the other projects that is running in our group. It has to do with papyrology, and in particular we ask different human annotators to look at small fragments of papyrus with Greek letters on them, which are, as you can see, deteriorated by the weather and by being in caves and everything. And the task that we ask them to do is to tell us what letters they see, or even what words they see. And here we have two pretty much different examples of fragments that we've shown to our experts, and that really exemplify different specimens of these fragments, which give rise to different types of disagreement. So the left one really has quite a lot of content. You see a couple of letters which are clearly visible, and the only ambiguous cases might arise at the edges of the fragment, where characters might only be partially visible or not really be visible at all. Whereas on the other hand, on the other side here on the slide, we see, well, we don't really see anything. We just see a brown fragment with maybe a lambda on it here in the middle, but the content itself is really very, very limited, and then in addition to that, the deterioration on the fragment itself is also very strong. So on the left case, first of all, the chances that there will be disagreement are a bit lower, and then if we, for example, provide other fragments that might have been originally attached to this one, then we raise the chances that experts will finally agree when they get more context of what is really around being around this fragment. Whereas for the other fragment, it's kind of hard to find any fragments that might have been attached to it because the borders are not very distinct and so on. So just having one notion of ambiguity and saying, okay, there is ambiguity and we kind of have to tackle that, doesn't really cater to the fact that there are different types of ambiguity and some of them might be resolved and some of them might not be. And then the third example that I would just like to quickly talk about is music transcription, which is basically the task of listening or looking at a music clip and then trying to visually annotate the notes that are being heard in that music clip. And what you see here is a browser-based interface that some of the people from our group use to present these music clips to our crowd workers. And these little boxes, these colored boxes, are the visual representations that the crowd workers actually put into the interface, telling us, okay, here I see a note, and it's maybe the pitch is X. So and in the visual and in the interface we represent the pitch by a color, and then the duration of this note is this and that, and so on. And here I'd just like to draw your attention to different types of expert disagreement or non-expert disagreement that can arise here. For example, if you look at the edge cases, people might just have just a very small chance of really hearing what's going on at the end of the music clip or at the very beginning of the music clip. And providing more context by adding the next music clip section or the previous music clip segment to it might actually dissolve disagreement in the edge areas if there is any. Whereas if you have multiple people and they disagree on what is the central note, then it will definitely be much harder to give them more context or make them somehow finally agree on what they really hear. So just from a very high level, we would like to kind of look at disagreement as a function of context. And really, what we would like to do is we would like to be able to determine whether certain types of disagreement between human annotators are resolvable or not. And we kind of hypothesize, without really having evaluated that in experiments so far, but we hypothesize that if we provide more context, which is on the x-axis here, then certain types of ambiguous instances might really drop in the disagreement rates, and we would call those resolvable, whereas others might kind of fluctuate on a high level. So for these ones, we would see the indication that maybe actually this is an inherently ambiguous instance. And having this information of whether an instance of disagreement is resolvable or maybe it is not resolvable can be fed into something more of a holistic framework for machine learning, is what we look at it. And this is just a very, very high-level diagram of how we imagine something could potentially look like. I'll just really slowly walk you through what we have here on the slide, which is on the upper left corner, we see the training examples, which is what everything starts with normally. And on the lower left corner, we have our crowd annotators. And then the first thing that happens is we show these training examples to our crowd annotators and ask them to give us the correct annotations. And the next step would be, okay, either all our crowd annotators agree on what the correct label is, or the other option would be there is disagreement. So this is the first yellow note there asking the question, is this actually an ambiguous instance or not? If it is not, if all of our crowd workers agree what the correct label is, then we're like, okay, easy. We can just forward that into the green bucket up there, which is just our regular gold standard training examples. But then on the other hand, if there is ambiguity, we have more work to do basically, and then the next question would be, can we resolve this ambiguity or not? Which we would do by, kind of this procedure again, by iteratively, in multiple cycles, providing more context and thus trying to find out whether this has any effect on the disagreement rates or not. And if we see that actually disagreement rates drop in response to the provision of more context, then we would assume, okay, maybe this is actually resolvable, and try to resolve it in the same fashion, so that we can actually put it back into the green bucket up there, which is the, okay, no problem, no ambiguity examples. And then the other ones, we would, instead of discarding them like most people would do, we would rather see a system where the correct answer is not forcefully merged into one correct example either, but instead we would have rather a distribution over correct answers maybe, so that the loss function of any classifier, which we intentionally keep abstract here, would kind of be able to deal with this distribution as a correct answer. So that the correct output would also not be one correct label, but really, okay, so if you give me that example and I should classify it for you, then me as a machine classifier, I know that also similar examples in the ground truth were ambiguous, so what I will output for you is also, okay, probably there will be disagreement and many people would say it's this answer and some other people would say it's that answer and so on. So, yeah. I mean, I'm definitely saying we haven't really implemented all of this into a working system yet, but it's more of a position and argument that we would like to make towards a more nuanced type of ground truth and the corresponding classifiers and the whole kind of holistic model that I just presented. Thank you very much. This was it.